A week and a day on, it is the attempted murder inquiry with no suspect people, only suspect places, suspected of contamination. Sergei Skripal's house cordoned from the public view at ground level. So too the restaurant Zizi, the graveyard where his wife and son lie buried, the Mill pub in Salisbury city centre. And the list of places of interest to investigators widened today: Sainsbury's supermarket, Outback, a Land Rover and masked investigator. The nation's gaze on Salisbury, where people are allowed to see nothing and know next to nothing. And out of town today, the village of Winterslow, 6 miles distant, added to this list. It's believed a vehicle was removed from this location this afternoon. And finally, in the past 2 hours, the Prime Minister said the nerve agent used was Novichock, produced in Russia since the 80s. A despicable act, she said.
The government has concluded that it is highly likely that Russia was responsible for the act against Sergei and Yulia Skripal. Mr. Speaker, there are therefore only 2 plausible explanations for what happened in Salisbury on the 4th of March. Either this was a direct act by the Russian state against our country, or the Russian government lost control of its potentially catastrophically damaging nerve agent and allowed it to get into the hands of others.
The Russian ambassador was summoned to the Foreign Office and asked to explain. The Prime Minister told the Commons Moscow has 48 hours to do so.
Should there be no credible response, we will conclude that this action amounts to an unlawful use of force by the Russian state against the United Kingdom. And I will come back to this House and set out the full range of measures that we will take in response. Mr. Speaker, this attempted murder using a weapons-grade nerve agent in a British town was not just a crime against the Skripals. It was an indiscriminate and reckless act against the United Kingdom, putting the lives of innocent civilians at risk.
In Salisbury itself, the handling of public information looks increasingly cack-handed. 6 days go by with the public being told any risk is negligible. Then suddenly hundreds of people who may have been at a variety of locations on Sunday, March the 4th, are asked to clean their clothes and wipe objects like mobile phones. And then came this morning's revelations from this man, Boris Karpichkov, another former Russian spy exiled in the UK. He claims Russian Secret Service warned him 3 weeks ago that Sergei Skripal would be killed.
First time when I was communicated this chilling message, I took it as a joke because I didn't believe.
And what was the message?
Message that something bad is going to happen with me and some other people, including Mr. Skripal, whom I have no idea before who this person is.
Who do you believe is responsible?
The Russian Secret Service, FSB specifically.
Acting on specific instructions from Vladimir Putin?
I wouldn't be so specific because I don't know whether or not it came directly from Mr. Putin, but it came from very, very senior level, close to Mr. Putin.
В Лондоне разгорается новый шпионский скандал.
And Russian public opinion back home? Well, here's last night's Vesti Nedeli, one of the most popular news programs in Russia. Behind the presenter, the caption with Big Ben reads, "A deathly place." Dmitry Kiselyov talking of a dangerous anti-Russian conspiracy in Britain to get momentum for an international boycott of Vladimir Putin's showpiece World Cup in Russia, 3 months away. And the boss, well, in a documentary broadcast last night, President Putin was asked, "Are you able to forgive?"
Да. Не все.
А что невозможно простить?
Предательство.
Вы так жестко сказали.
But all eyes, it seems, are apparently on this deathly place come Wednesday. Then the government says it will act against what it insists is either criminal negligence by the Kremlin or just plain Kremlin crime.
Our chief correspondent Alex Thompson. Well, our political editor Gary Gibbon is in Westminster now. Fighting talk there from an embattled Prime Minister, right?
Yes, and the question will be, if it comes to action, will the action match the rhetoric? What are the consequences that Theresa May is talking about. Now, one of them is almost certainly bound to be sanctions. I'm sure the government is exploring whether they can bring additional sanctions against individuals and the Russian state. The thing about sanctions is you can bring them in as one country, but they only really have bite if you bring them in with other countries, like, for instance, our partners in the EU. And that is a process, as we've discovered over the years, that can move a bit more slowly than some would like. There's talk of sending additional troops to the Russian border with the Baltics. You don't need EU permission for that, but its effectiveness in actually pressurizing Putin might be questioned by some. There is inevitably going to be talk of some sort of expulsion of diplomats here. I doubt Theresa May will want to break off diplomatic relations altogether. Britain is seen as a country that has useful eyes and ears in Russia by some of its allies. There'll be some reluctance to do that. And frankly, diplomats are always squeamish about these expulsions because they end up with tit-for-tat expulsions and the process eventually builds up again further down the line. One diplomat was just speculating to me that just maybe Theresa May would be interested in referring Vladimir Putin to the International Criminal Court. She'd need evidence for that. She wouldn't get very far with it because Russia has a veto on the UN Security Council. But that's a possibility. Whatever happens, we'll get to hear about it. It is expected after the deadline when the National Security Council will meet on Wednesday morning, and then Theresa May will come to the Commons.
We'll be watching. Gary Gibbon, thanks very much. Well, let's go straight to Salisbury and Paul McNamara. Paul, what's the latest there on the inquiry?
Yes, evening from yet another cordoned off section of the city. This is actually a car park that overlooks the bench where Sergei Skripal and his daughter were found. It's about 50 metres over in that direction. In fact, in the last couple of minutes, there's been a bit of a flurry of activity as another few vehicles have arrived on the scene. But across Salisbury and now in at least one outlying village, this is becoming a familiar scene as members of the military and emergency services turn up and examine vehicles. But this cordon went up this afternoon. Last night, Public Health England put out a warning to anyone that may have been in the Zizi and the pub The Mill on the day that Sergei Skripal was there a week ago to wash all of your clothes. And many people here in Salisbury are saying, why is this cordon? Why did that message? Why have they taken a week to come out? Now, Public Health England, of course, saying that there is very little risk to the public. There is no need to worry. The source of that worry, though, today was given a name by Theresa May. Novichock, a military-grade nerve agent. And people here now want to know, how does a military-grade nerve agent arrive on UK streets? And almost more importantly, how was it delivered? Well, how was it administered to this 66-year-old former spy here in Salisbury?
Paul McNamara, thanks very much. Well, Marina Litvinenko is the widow of the former Russian spy Alexander Litvinenko, who died in London after he was poisoned with polonium in 2006. She joins us now from Berlin. Thank you very much for coming on the programme, Mrs. Litvinenko. You have gone through something very similar to this, worse because your husband actually died. When you hear about this, when you hear about the accusations, when you hear about the poison, what goes through your mind?
First of all, I would like to say it's happened only 1 week, and Theresa May blamed Russia behind of this crime. We were waiting almost for 10 years before we achieved a right for public inquiry, and only after verdict was released, we could say, yes, it was Russia state behind of this crime, and Theresa May have a speech in Parliament in 2016 saying exactly the same what we heard today.
So what you're saying is that you're gratified to hear the kind of tough words that you heard today from the Prime Minister that you didn't hear immediately after your husband's death in 2006?
Yes, it's not only immediately reaction, it was even some kind of preventing to bring all evidence what was collected during investigation to public. And we should fight for public inquiry to understand what actually police collected and why these two suspects, we know this name, Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun, who killed my husband, and now they are in Russia, and even more, Andrei Lugovoy is a member of parliament of Russian Duma, and everything what we have since investigation of death of my husband, it looks like was not done enough, and now we have a very similar case in Salisbury.
So what kind of actions would you like to see this government take if the Russians don't come back with a suitable explanation tomorrow night, and if it is proved beyond any reasonable doubt that they were responsible?
I need to be very accurate to give any advice, because I'm a personal, emotionally involved in this case, and I don't like to push people to do something extra or very hard. But it's absolutely right things to make a personal sanctions against people who've been involved in such crime and who've been involved in financial crime. And how do we know? It's some kind of law already used in United States. It's Magnitsky law. Few countries in Europe already joined the same Magnitsky law, but only UK not involved. And I would say some kind of things we have to do here in UK.
Do you think that if the British government had been tougher after the death of your husband, had spoken the kind of words that we heard today, and actually followed up with real consequences, that this current poisoning might have been avoided?
No, again, when we've been preventing to have a public inquiry, and one point it was is a relationship. And I could see how a British government tried very hard to save this relationship after knowledge. Polonium, what was used to kill my husband, was from Russia. These two agents were from Russia. But British government tried to do it very hard, because Russia every time play a main role in a world. Particularly we had Syria, and involvement in Russia in this process was every time very important. And I just don't like if might happen something similar, and it would be decision again to save this world and just make this all easy.
Got to leave it there. Marina Litvinenko, thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme. Well, from Westminster is Conservative MP Tom Tugendhat, Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Welcome to the programme, Tom Tugendhat. Prime Minister, again, as we said earlier, tough talk today in the Commons. She threatened consequences if we don't get a suitable explanation by tomorrow night. What will they be, those consequences?
Well, the Prime Minister has a range of options at her disposal, Matt, from tightening of sanctions to particularly more targeted sanctions, including sanctions on some of the individuals who are connected to the Kremlin, whether directly or through immediate family, which give cause for concern. So there's a whole range of things she can do. And she also spoke very clearly about working with allies. This is a moment at which working with allies is particularly important, of course, because if we're looking to put sanctions on a regime and those who support it, then making sure that they apply as widely as possible is important.
I'm curious that we haven't heard from quite a number of those allies. In fact, there's a bit of a deafening silence. Berlin, which has been at the forefront of sanctions against Russia after Crimea, hasn't said anything yet. Paris hasn't said anything yet. We're only just getting some reaction from Washington. Does that worry you, that we seem a bit isolated at the moment?
No, Matt, it's not surprising at all. The Prime Minister's only just made her statement to the House, which details the incident and points the finger so squarely at Moscow, either deliberately, as she said, or accidentally, because it's losing control of the regime and the chemical weapon stocks. So it's hardly surprising that none of our allies have made a comment, because they wouldn't until they had an official statement from government on this.
But, I mean, the Prime Minister, in her very tough statement, says that Russia is the highly likely culprit. That is kind of, it opens the door to some doubt. At the same time, you've got the Kremlin saying that this is a circus show and a bit of a fairy tale. What's your response to that?
Well, Matt, she was extremely clear. She said the source is clearly weapons-grade chemical weapons from Russia. She said the manufacturing was clearly Russian, and therefore she pointed the finger very clearly at Russia. The only thing she said was in any form of doubt was either the Kremlin is losing control of its chemical weapon stocks, in which case it is a very dangerous country, or it is the Kremlin itself that ordered it, in which case it is a very rogue regime.
But they're rather different things, aren't they? If there is gross negligence here, do you think that sanctions or stepping up the pressure in some form is the appropriate way to respond?
Well, that's why she's waiting until she hears back from the Russian ambassador, because it's absolutely essential that we find out what the truth is before we respond. And I very much welcome the fact that the ambassador has been summoned, because the behaviour of the Russian state at worst is criminal and at best is criminally irresponsible.
Do we really think that whatever measures she comes up with, let's say, stepped up sanctions, will work when the sanctions already in place from the European Union after Crimea have not done a single thing to alter Russia's policy?
Well,
Russia seems to be basically getting away with bombing civilians in Syria, and none of the condemnation that's come from this part of the world has made any difference at all.
Well, Matt, you're pointing to the fact that we need to work much better together on this, and indeed, you're absolutely right that we need to make sure that we target much more accurately those who are responsible. One of the problems with sanctions is that it has been too widespread in that too many ordinary people are affected by the sanctions. What we need to do is we need to target those sanctions at the individuals who are the acolytes, the aristocrats, if you like, of the new Kremlin aristocracy, and we need to make sure that their life of luxury, having been which they have stolen off the Russian people over 20 years, is stopped. I mean, people like Putin have accumulated hundreds of billions of dollars worth of assets, and that they cannot be left to enjoy them.